All right, so last time we looked at Schaeffer-Landau's first chapter on Kant's moral philosophy, the Kantian perspective, justice and fairness. And now we're taking a look at the other chapter on Kant's moral philosophy, the Kantian perspective, autonomy and respect. And if you want to understand some of the differences between the normative theory that we discussed last week, utilitarianism, and the Kantian perspective, or Kant's moral philosophy, then it would be good to pay attention to the subtitles of those two chapters: fairness, justice, autonomy, respect. We talked a lot last week about apparent counterexamples to utilitarianism, that is to say, problematic cases for utilitarianism. Here again, as we saw, utilitarianism says that the right act is always the one that maximizes good consequences. But when we were looking at that chapter of arguments against utilitarianism, we talked about a lot of kinds of cases where you could maximize good consequences by treating someone unfairly, or by treating someone unjustly, or by violating someone's rights, or by taking away someone's autonomy. So you just focus on the subtitles of these two chapters: fairness, justice, autonomy, respect, and that helps you to understand a lot about the differences between utilitarianism and Kant's moral philosophy. Kant's view is that to treat someone unfairly is intrinsically bad and cannot be made good by any measure of good consequences. To treat someone unjustly, that is to say, for example, to violate someone's rights, is intrinsically bad and cannot be made good by any measure of good consequences. To take away someone's autonomy is intrinsically bad and cannot be made good by any measure of good consequences. So when we were looking last week at that chapter in which Schaeffer-Landau presents a number of arguments against utilitarianism, you'll recall that one of the criticisms was that on the utilitarian view, no act is intrinsically wrong or intrinsically right. By way of contrast, Kant believed that some acts are intrinsically wrong. Here again, just to follow the subtitles of these two chapters, to treat someone unjustly or to take away someone's autonomy is intrinsically wrong. That is to say, there's something in the very nature of the act that makes it wrong. Here again, utilitarians have to deny that there's ever anything in the very nature of an act that can make it wrong. So in principle, anything could be justified if, in the circumstance, doing it would maximize good consequences. But that is not, as we said last time, that is not the Kantian perspective. As we said last time, Kantianism is a kind of anti-consequentialism. Kant's view is that the consequences of an act cannot make it right or wrong. We talked a little bit last time about what is required from Kant's point of view for an act to be right. We talked last time about the categorical imperative. Again, act only on a maxim, that is to say a rule. Act only on a rule that you could rationally will to hold as a universal law. That is to say, think about the rule that you're proposing to act on, and then conduct this thought experiment. What if that were a universal law? That is to say, what if everyone in the world followed that same rule? And then ask yourself this: in that world, would it be possible for me to achieve the goal that I had had in mind when I adopted that rule? So we talked about some examples of this last time. We looked last time at the test for a lying promise. Say, for example, in a world in which everybody followed the rule, in order to get myself out of a difficulty, I'll make a lying promise. In that world, you would not be able to achieve the goal that you had had when you adopted the rule. In order to get myself out of this difficulty, I'll make a lying promise, because in that world there wouldn't be any such thing as the social convention of making promises. The whole social convention of promising would go out of existence if everybody understood that when you utter the words "I promise," that doesn't commit you to anything, that doesn't bind you to any future course of action. Then the whole social convention would be pointless, wouldn't it? It would go out of existence, and so it wouldn't be possible in that world to achieve the goal that you had had. Maybe you adopted that rule because you needed money, and you knew the only way that you could get the money was to make the promise, but you also knew that it was a lying promise. You also knew that you weren't going to be able to repay the money. But you reflected on this question of what ought I to do? And here again, how do you know? How do you know what to do when you're in a dilemma? Well, we saw Kant's answer to that question last time. Think about what is universalizable. That is to say, think about what could hold, which you could rationally will to hold as a universal law. So that's the test. So as we saw last time, Kant's fundamental moral principle, the categorical imperative, does not make any reference to consequences. Kant puts to the side calculating good and bad consequences. As we saw last time, the intention behind the act is much more important for Kantianism than any consequences of the act. The consequences from the Kantian point of view are irrelevant. Again, we saw last time that if the intention behind an act is good, according to Kant, then even if the consequences of it end up being bad, it was still a morally right act. And conversely, if the intention behind the act was a bad one, a morally bad intention, even if the act just inadvertently, just accidentally turns out to have good consequences, it was still a morally wrong thing. Maybe somebody intended to harm someone else, and just inadvertently, accidentally, he ended up helping them or benefiting them in some way. Well, from the fact that it turned out well, that doesn't change the moral nature of the act. It was still a morally wrong act in Kant's view, because here again, Kant says the goodness or the badness of the consequences cannot determine the rightness or wrongness of an act. That's determined by the intention behind an act on this view. So Schaefer-Landau starts off this chapter discussing a problem for utilitarianism, and here again it's related to this point that he made in the chapter where he presents the arguments against utilitarianism. Here again, as we said before, on the utilitarian view, nothing is intrinsically wrong or intrinsically right. And many people have found that a problematic aspect of utilitarianism. It's problematic because here again, if nothing is intrinsically wrong, then what? Rape could possibly be morally justified. Slavery could possibly be morally justified. That strikes many people as completely implausible. To come back to this point that I was making a moment ago, by way of contrast, in the Kantian perspective, some acts are by their very nature bad and cannot be made good. That's what is meant here by saying the act is intrinsically bad or intrinsically wrong. So Schaefer-Landau starts off the chapter discussing this example of slavery. As he discusses in the early pages of the chapter, utilitarians have to acknowledge that on their theory, on their principle, the principle of utility, it is possible to justify slavery. If it could be arranged in such a way that only 10% of the population were harmed and 90% of the population benefited, then in order to be consistent, the utilitarian would have to acknowledge that it's morally justified. But I think a lot of people believe that it never could be morally justified. So this is a problem for utilitarianism. He talks about utilitarian philosophers who have acknowledged that to be consistent with their own theory, they do have to admit that slavery could, in principle, under certain conditions, maybe if it were arranged a certain way, maybe it could be morally justified. Here again, it would have to be arranged in such a way that the balance of happiness, the balance of good consequences, there's the greatest possible balance of good consequences over bad consequences. The good consequences outweigh the bad consequences. Some people are harmed, but more people benefit. Now, as Schaefer-Landau is also quick to add, no utilitarian has ever defended any actual historical example of slavery. They're not saying that any actual historical example of slavery was ever such that it maximized good consequences. So they never defended any actual existing historical example of slavery. But still, many people reading about the theory find it troubling, find it problematic that even in theory, even hypothetically, under certain conditions, it could be justified on the utilitarian view. That's the objection. Here again, on the Kantian view, or the deontological view, as it's also sometimes called the rights-based moral theory. On the Kantian view, slavery is intrinsically wrong. Why is that? What is it about the nature of it that explains why it's, here again, intrinsically, by its very nature, bad and can't be made good by any measure of good consequences? Well, Kantian moral philosophy does have an answer to that question. Why is it intrinsically wrong? Because it treats people as mere means rather than as ends in themselves. It takes away autonomy, which is every human being's right. So in the chapter on utilitarianism, the chapter in which Schaefer-Landau presented arguments on behalf of utilitarianism, when you think back on it, the concept of rights didn't really play much of a role in utilitarian theory, did it? Utilitarians are reluctant to talk about rights because we think of rights as something that cannot just be overturned by a calculation of good and bad consequences. If someone has a right, such as the right to autonomy, here again, we've talked about autonomy before in the first part of the class. Autonomy means having the power to make your own choices about your life, the power to run your own life, make your own decisions about things that affect your life. Everybody here again on the Kantian view, everybody has a right to that. And a right is something that can't be taken away just because in any particular circumstance doing that would maximize good consequences. And we talked about examples of that kind last week. So that's why, for example, something like slavery is intrinsically wrong on the Kantian view. It violates a right. It takes away autonomy. And here again, to say the same thing a slightly different way, it treats people as mere means rather than as ends in themselves. So this notion that it's never morally permissible to treat somebody only as a means to your end, only as a means to your goal, rather than as someone who has goals of her own, that's always wrong in Kant's moral philosophy. And the name of that principle in Kant's moral philosophy is the principle of humanity. The principle of humanity is always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means. So it's never, on this view, it's never morally permissible to treat another human being as if he or she were just a physical object, just a means to your end. It's always wrong, for example, to use someone. If you're just using them for whatever, that's always wrong. This qualification here, mere means, it's never morally permissible to use someone as a mere means. This qualification is important. What that means is that it's never morally permissible to treat someone only as a means. That's the key. Because it is permissible to treat other people as means. We do it all the time. And there's nothing wrong with that so long as at the same time you're doing it in a way that is respectful and that respects the fact that that person also has autonomy, that person also has rationality, and is deserving of respect. So long as you do it in that way, treating a person as a means is fine. What is wrong is treating someone only as a means, treating someone as a mere means. That is not morally permissible on this view. So what would be an example of treating someone as a means, but not treating them only as a means? Take, for example, a server, a waiter or a waitress. You select the item that you want off of the menu, and then you tell the waiter or the waitress what you want, and he goes and or she goes and gets it for you. So you just used that person as a means to your end. You wanted the food, you wanted the item off the menu, and you used the server as a means to that end. Now, there's nothing morally wrong with that, is there? That's perfectly fine. because presumably you're doing it in a way that is also respectful of the fact that that person also has goals of his own or her own. Your goal was to get the food, and you used the person as a means to get the food. And here again, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So long as you did it in a way that at the same time recognizes that that person also has goals of his own, goals of her own. That person also has rationality. That person also has reason. And so that person is also, at the same time, deserving of respect. So if you treat someone as a means, you must at the same time do it in a way that is respectful, that respects that person's autonomy, that respects the fact that that person has goals, plans, projects of his own, and is not only a means, is not merely a means to your goals. That's what is meant here. So always treat a human being as an end, never as a mere means. Here again, this never, right, that stands in contrast to what we saw in utilitarianism, doesn't it? Because here again, utilitarians don't say that any kind of act may never be morally permissible. Here again, whatever kind of act is in question, if there is a circumstance, if there is a case in which it would maximize good consequences, then the utilitarians say that it's morally justified. We didn't really see the word never as something that figures in utilitarian moral reasoning, did we? Except maybe something like, they would say something like, never do the act that wouldn't maximize good consequences. But here again, when it comes to any particular kind of act, there aren't any nevers in utilitarianism. So that does stand as a contrast between these two approaches. Why was it so important that you always treat another human being as an end in herself or an end in himself, never as a mere means? Why was that so important to Kant? Well, Kant would observe that in nature, humans alone, only human beings, are able to reflect on different possible courses of action and deliberate on the question of what they ought to do. In virtue of this capacity for laying down for ourselves the rules that we're going to follow, we are choosers of ends. So that person that you're using as a means is a chooser. You're a chooser of ends. Here again, in my example, you chose as your goal, you chose as your end the food, and you used the server as the means to get as a means to secure that end. But that person is also a chooser of ends, and so you have to do it in a way that is respectful of the fact that that person is also a chooser of ends. And here again, from Kant's point of view, that is unique to human beings. Everything else in nature is a mere means. Physical objects, animals, here again, anything that lacks reason, that lacks the distinctively human capacity, anything that lacks rationality in the world is a mere means to ends. A rock is only a means to an end. A stick is only a means to an end because they don't have rationality. Our rationality, our capacity to deliberate on what's right and to choose it because it's right, makes us ends in ourselves rather than mere means to someone else's ends. So in many respects, as we've seen, Kant's moral philosophy is quite different from utilitarianism. It's quite different from any kind of consequentialism, as we've seen. The value theory that it's based on is also quite different from what we saw in utilitarianism. You'll recall that utilitarianism is a normative theory, a theory about right action, is based on hedonism as a value theory. That is to say, hedonism is a theory about the good. And as you'll recall, the principle of utility says maximize good consequences, where good is understood as, here again on the basis of hedonism, good is understood as whatever will tend to promote pleasure or happiness. Kant, by way of contrast, would deny that happiness is intrinsically good. Kant would argue, for example, that happiness is not always good. It's not intrinsically good. For one thing, bad people who are happy don't deserve to be happy. Some people are happy, but they shouldn't be. They don't deserve to be. So that right there, from Kant's point of view, shows that happiness is not intrinsically good. It's not good without qualification. It is good, but with a certain qualification, with a certain condition, namely the qualification that the person who is happy deserves to be from the moral point of view. Isn't a person who's done lots of evil things. If some person who's done lots of evil things is happy about it, well, that's not a good thing from Kant's point of view. So that just goes to show, according to Kant, that happiness is not intrinsically good. So Kant's moral philosophy is based on a theory of value that's quite different from what we saw in utilitarianism. It's not based on hedonism. Kant's view is that the only intrinsic value is the intention to do the right thing. This is specifically human phenomenon, this phenomenon that really has only to do with beings that can exercise their rationality, namely human beings. He called it the goodwill, this intention to do the right thing. And that's the only thing that has any intrinsic value, according to Kant. The only intrinsic value is the intention to do the right thing, from the motive that it is the right thing. That's what Kant called the goodwill. That is to say, for the only reason being that it is the right thing to do, and that's the only reason. Moral worth exists only in the motive of fulfilling our moral obligations for their own sake, rather than for the sake of any good consequences that might be associated with their fulfillment. That is to say, do your duty for its own sake. So from Kant's point of view, the only morally relevant consideration is this issue: what does the moral law require? Consequences, here again, are irrelevant. Bad consequences can't make an act, do not necessarily make an act morally wrong. And good consequences do not necessarily make an act morally right. The consequences can't determine that. Only the moral law can. What do I mean by the moral law here? Here again, the two fundamental moral principles that we've talked about in connection with Kant's moral philosophy. The categorical imperative, act only on the rule that you could will to be a universal law, and the principle of humanity, always treat a human being as an end in himself or herself, never as a mere means. You consult those two principles, and you know what your duty is. And to fulfill your duty is the only morally good motive. Considerations to do with the consequences. Well, will this produce more happiness than unhappiness? Those kinds of utilitarian calculations. From the Kantian point of view, those have to be put to the side. Those are irrelevant when it comes to determining right and wrong. The only intrinsic value is the goodwill. Kant wrote, "Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a goodwill." So there are many good things, but here again, with this one exception of the goodwill, they're all good with a certain qualification, or with certain qualifications. Here again, to go back to the example of happiness, which, as we saw, utilitarians say that that is the only intrinsically good thing. As we see, Kant does not agree with that. Happiness is good with the qualification that it's deserved, that the person who is happy is morally deserving of happiness. Everything that is good comes with some kind of condition like that, comes with some kind of qualification like that. With this one exception, there's only one intrinsic value, and that is this intention to do the right thing, what Kant called the goodwill. That's the only thing in the world, or even out of it, as he puts it here, that could be said to be good without qualification, only the goodwill. Kant put the point this way: even if it should happen that this will should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, and there should remain only the goodwill, then, like a jewel, it would still shine by its own light as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add to nor take away anything from this value. So here again, as I said the last time, Kant's moral philosophy is a kind of anti-consequentialism. Here again, its usefulness or fruitlessness, that is to say, if the intention behind the act was a morally good one, then even if it was completely fruitless, let's say there were no good consequences at all, or let's go back to earlier in this passage here, suppose the person who has the good intention has no power at all to bring about the purpose that he has in mind. but it's a morally good intention. It's a morally good purpose. It's a morally good thing to want to bring about. Does the fact that the person lacks the power to bring it about, does that in any way diminish the moral value? Kant would say no. And here again, even if the act ends up being completely fruitless, no good consequences result at all, does that in any way diminish the moral value? No, Kant would say, because the intention behind the act was a morally good one, like a jewel, that act still shines by its own light. It has its whole value in itself. The fact that it turned out to be fruitless, it ended up having no good consequences at all, that fact cannot in any way diminish, cannot in any way undermine the moral value of what was a right act. Here again, because the intention behind it was morally right. So here again, consider the example of you help someone across the street. A little old man or a little old lady is obviously going to have difficulty making it across the street, is struggling. It's obvious that that person's going to have difficulty at a big intersection on a busy street. So you decide to help that person, and then suppose through some catastrophe that you could not possibly have foreseen, suppose it's something like, say for example, a meteorite strikes the person. Here again, you could not possibly have foreseen that a meteorite would land where and when it did. Okay, let's say that person that you're helping across the street is struck by a meteorite and killed. Okay, well, does it mean, now that was obviously a bad consequence. Obviously, your well-intended act there turned out to be totally fruitless. There were no good consequences at all. The person was killed, and if you hadn't tried to help the person, if you had just left the person there in the corner, then the person wouldn't have been killed by that meteorite. But does it follow from that fact that there were no good consequences at all? Does it follow that it was not a morally right act, that it was not a morally good act? Kant would say no. Even if the act was completely fruitless, that fact does not in any way, does not take anything away from the moral value of that act. So again, the intention behind the act determines, from Kant's point of view, the intention behind the act determines whether the act was right or wrong, not the consequences. So two different views, quite different as we've seen. I touched on this before. Kant's view is that morality has to be about what is within our control. And you know, the consequences of your action are in the world. But we don't control the world. Once you act, then the ripple effects of your action, the consequences, the repercussions out in the world, none of that is within your control. But here again, morality has to be about what is within our control. We don't hold people morally responsible for things over which they had absolutely no control. We don't hold animals morally responsible for the damage that they do. We don't hold babies morally responsible for the damage that they do. You can't be morally responsible for something over which you had no control. So, as I mentioned before, Kant believed that very strongly, and believed that morality has to be about what is within your control. And not only is the world, the physical world external to your mind, not only is that not within your control, but Kant's view is that even your psychological makeup, even your psychological makeup is to some extent determined by factors that were not within your control. Here again, the only realm in which we have freedom, the only area of life where we do have control, is the exercise of our reason. And so that's why, for Kant, morality is about rationality. As I've said before, for utilitarianism, as we saw, the key moral property is sentience. The fact that something can experience pain or pleasure gives it a certain moral status. For Kant, that's not true. Kant denies that. Kant believes that sentience is not the key moral property. Kant believes that rationality, reason, is the key moral property. That's what makes a being a member of the moral community, or that is what makes a being someone who's within the scope of the moral community. That is to say, that's what gives a being moral status, namely this capacity to reflect on the question, what ought I to do, and to deliberate on different possible courses of action, and to consider the reasons on behalf of different actions, and then choose the reason that provides a moral justification for the action. Only beings with reason can do that. Only rational beings can do that. So Kant believes the only area in which we have freedom is in our reason. So here again, the consequences of your action, those are in the world. You don't control that. You don't control those. And even some of your even some of your internal life, even some of your psychological life is not really within your control. There are other sides to our there are other parts to our inner lives besides just our rationality, besides just our reason. And here again, as we've seen for Kant, the only intrinsically good thing is this intention to do the right thing, this intention to do one's duty, this intention to act from the motive of duty, simply to do what the moral law requires because it is the right thing to do. And Kant goes on to say, there are many minds so sympathetically constituted that they find pleasure in spreading joy around them. But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however proper, however amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth. For the maxim lacks the moral import, namely that such actions be done from duty, not from inclination. So Kant is talking here about the kind of person for whom it's easy to help others, for whom it's easy to be generous, for whom it's easy to be kind. He's talking about a certain kind of psychological makeup, a kind of personality, a kind of psychological disposition. The kind of person who finds it easy to be generous, the kind of person who gets pleasure, gets happiness from making other people happy, the person who derives gratification from going around making other people happy. There are such people, of course. Many people just in a spontaneous, natural way that's just a part of their psychological makeup are just naturally disposed, just naturally inclined to want to help people, to want to try to make other people happy, to be kind and generous to other people. There are such people, of course. But it's an interesting question. What if somebody isn't built that way, psychologically speaking? What if someone isn't wired that way? Does that person still have a reason to help others? Does that person still have a reason to perform acts of kindness and generosity and to go around helping others? Even if that person has no desire to do so, even if that person has no natural inclination, no natural disposition to do that, psychologically the person just isn't built that way, just isn't wired that way. Could that person still have a reason to do the right thing? Well, Kant's answer to that question is yes, because that person still has reason. And here again, as I said a moment ago, for Kant, morality is about rationality. It's about exercising your reason. So even that person can reflect on this question. That person might think to himself, I just don't desire to help others. I don't want to harm them, but I'm just not moved to help them. But that person might still ask himself, but what does morality require of me? What am I morally required to do? And then, as we know, on Kant's view, that person would consult the categorical imperative. I should only act on a rule that I could will to be a universal law. So that person might be considering a rule like this. In order to avoid the inconvenience to myself, I just won't help anyone. Okay. But let's apply the test of the categorical imperative. Again, act only on a rule that you could wish to be a universal law. Could you rationally will, if that were your psychological makeup, and you were considering adopting that as your maxim, as your rule? Could you rationally will that that be the universal law, that that be the rule everyone act on? Could you rationally will that everybody follow the maxim? In order to avoid the inconvenience, I just won't help anyone. So in that world, no one would help anyone. Could you rationally will to live in a world in which no one helped anyone? Kant thought that that would be irrational. Think of all the ways in which we depend on the help of others. Think of all the ways in which to get to the point in your life that you're at, you depended on the help of others in countless ways, in so many ways. Think of the first few years of your life. When you're infant and a toddler, you're totally dependent on the help of others. And then think of all the way that up to this point in your life you've been benefited by the inventions of others, the discoveries of others, the knowledge of others, right? We benefit from others in countless ways. So it would be totally irrational, according to Kant, to try to will that everybody follow the rule, I just won't help anyone. And his point is that even a person who is not by nature sympathetic, is not by nature inclined or disposed to want to help others, not really spontaneously or naturally charitable or generous, even that person, because he has reason or she has reason, can come to see that moral duty requires us to help others. So this is a distinctive aspect of Kant's moral philosophy, and an interesting one. One way that Kant makes the point is to give this example of the gloomy philanthropist, as the example has come to be known in the ethical literature. Kant gives the example of a man who has no benevolent feelings, that is to say, no desire to help others. He feels no sympathy for them. Again, like I said a moment ago, he doesn't want to harm anyone, but he just has no desire to help anyone. Psychologically, he's just not built that way. He's a philanthropist. That word means a person who goes around doing charitable deeds, a person who goes around raising money for charity and donating money to charity and giving to all kinds of charitable causes. But he's gloomy with respect to his inner life. He's by temperament, by psychological makeup, cold and indifferent to the sufferings of others. Nonetheless, he performs benevolent acts. He goes around helping people because he sees it as a moral duty. And this is an example of, here again, somebody being motivated by what Kant called the goodwill. He has a goodwill. So despite the fact that he derives no pleasure from helping people, he does it. And in Kant's opinion, the gloomy philanthropist is as morally outstanding as anyone because he acts for the sake of duty. Kant put the point this way: if nature has put little sympathy in the heart of this or that man, if he is by temperament cold and indifferent to the sufferings of others, would he still not find in himself a source whence to give himself a far higher moral worth than that of a good-natured temperament could be? Unquestionably, it is just in this, that he is beneficent not from inclination, but from duty. So by beneficent here is meant he goes around helping people. He goes around doing benevolent deeds, beneficent deeds. The word is connected to the word benefit in a way that you can obviously see, right? He goes around trying to benefit, that is to say, trying to help people. And he does it because, here again, simply in virtue of the fact that he has reason, even if he's not by temperament, even if he's not by psychological makeup, naturally or spontaneously inclined to help others or to be charitable, he can still, because he has reason, reflect on this question: what ought I to do? And consult the moral law. And by consulting the moral law, here again, the categorical imperative in the principle of humanity, we can come to see what morality requires of us. So again, for Kant, morality is about rationality. It's about reason. That pretty much concludes my remarks about Kant's moral philosophy. I'll just mention one more thought experiment that has been put forward as a thought experiment that challenges consequentialism. That is to say, a thought experiment that is put forward to support anti-consequentialism. As I've emphasized now a number of times, Kantian moral philosophy is anti-consequentialist. here again, the main version of consequentialism that we talked about last week was utilitarianism. And as we saw, utilitarians say the right act is the one that will maximize good consequences, bring about the greatest balance of happy over unhappy consequences. As we've seen, Kant denies that. Kant denies that the consequences of an act can make it right or wrong. So here's another thought experiment on behalf of anti-consequentialism put forward by Louis Poyman. You're a utilitarian physician. There's 5 patients under your care. One needs a heart transplant, one needs 2 lungs, one needs a liver, and the last 2 each need a kidney. Now, into your office comes a healthy bachelor needing an immunization. Via a utility calculus, you determine that you could do the most good by injecting the healthy man with a fatal drug and then using his organs to save your 5 other patients. Well, utilitarianism requires that you do that. Clearly, in this case, there is a course of action that would maximize good consequences. Only 1 person would die and 5 lives would be saved. But to many people, this seems clearly wrong. Many people would be reluctant to say that that's the right thing to do. I don't think many people believe that that would be the right thing to do. So this is an apparent counterexample to utilitarianism. So in the second unit of the course, we've looked at 2 normative theories. The principle of utility. Here again, utilitarianism is based on the principle of utility. That says the right act is the one that maximizes good consequences or minimizes bad consequences, where good is understood as tending to promote pleasure or happiness, and bad is understood as tending to promote pain and unhappiness. And then this week we've looked at Kant's moral philosophy, the Kantian moral philosophy, which is a kind of anti-consequentialism. It denies that the consequences of an act can make it right or wrong. As we've seen, for Kant, the relevant considerations are not the consequences. The relevant considerations are fairness, justice, autonomy, respect. So these are 2 quite different normative theories. They present fundamentally opposed claims about right and wrong, fundamentally opposed in the sense that they can't both be right. So this is an old debate in moral philosophy, and you'll have to decide for yourself what to think about this debate. And you'll have to think for yourself about which theory you find more persuasive.